Good evening and welcome to I'm Chris Parnell.
Reporting from Moscow.
Tbilisi.
Times Square.
May your dreams be your only boundaries in life.
I would think how words go straight up in a thin line, quick and harmless, and how terribly doing goes along the earth, clinging to it, so that after a while the two lines are too far apart for the same person to straddle from one to the other. And that sin, and love, and fear are just sounds that people who never sinned, nor loved, nor feared, have for what they never had, and cannot have, until they forget the words. William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying.
Memory believes before knowing remembers, believes longer than recollects, longer than knowing even wonders. Knows remembers believes a corridor in a big, long, garbled, cold, echoing building of dark red brick, soot-bleakened by more chimneys than its own. Set in a grassless, cinder-strewn packed compound surrounded by smoking factory, pervious and enclosed by a 10-foot steel and wire fence, like a penitentiary or a zoo. We're in random erratic surges, with sparrow-like child trembling, orphans in identical and uniform blue denim, in and out of remembering, but in knowing constant in the bleak wells. The bleak windows wherein rains soot from the yearly adjacent chimneys, streaked like black tears. William Faulkner, Light in August.
Some things you must always be unable to bear. Some things you must never stop refusing to bear. Injustice and outrage and dishonor and shame, no matter how young you are or how old you have got. Not for kudos and not for cash. Your picture in the paper, nor money in the back either. Just refuse to bear them. William Faulkner, Intruder in the Dust.
I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. The writer's duty is to write about these things. It is his privilege to help a man endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. The poet's voice need not merely be the record of man. It can be one of the props, the pillars to help him endure and prevail. Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of GHS-TV's award-winning talk show, Crosstalk. I'm your host, Sara Mayers. Today we have a very special show for you. We've traveled down to Oxford, Mississippi to visit the home of one of the most gifted writers of the 20th century. Just 80 miles south of Memphis is Rowan Oak, William Faulkner's private home. Here he wrote some of his best short stories and novels that are still inspiring us today. Today we're going to take you on an inside look of Rowan Oak. So without further ado, let's begin our tour. William Faulkner purchased the primitive large Greek revival house in 1930. Tucked amidst 4 acres of cedar and hardwood trees, the house, originally known as Bailey Place, predates the Civil War. Faulkner later renamed the estate Rowan Oak. It served as the family's home until 1962, the year of Faulkner's death. The first room on our tour is the library. The library's walls originally featured wildlife murals painted by Miss Ellen Bailey. Faulkner whitewashed and plastered the walls. Faulkner's mother, Maud, created a portrait of him above the mantel and a portrait of Preacher Green Ligon. Faulkner built the plain white pine shelf complete with a locking compartment underneath to store a shotgun away from the children in the house. Faulkner wrote only in this room until he added an office in the rear of the house in 1950. Once Faulkner started writing in his office, he placed his typewriter on a small table given to him by his mother. He used this table for nearly all of his years at Rowan Oak. Here Faulkner stretched the plot outline of a fable on the wall using a plain graphite pencil and a red grease pencil. This Faulknerian creation is reminiscent of the storyboard, a technique he likely picked up while working for various Hollywood film studios. Also downstairs, the parlor was used for special occasions in the Mary Faulkner family. This Chickering piano was used by Faulkner's wife. Her sheet music collection, located in this cabinet, dates back to the 1890s. Faulkner brought this Japanese doll back from Nagano in 1955. The stairs lead up to the bedrooms. Here in Faulkner's bedroom, a pair of boat shoes still caked with mud lay on the floor, and on the mantel there is an identified number 64 that was worn by Faulkner at a Virginia horse show. The old kitchen is located on the ground of Rowan Oak. It was built by slaves. Throughout the grounds there are several gardens, including Faulkner's Rose Garden. William Faulkner lived a quiet yet productive life here at his beloved Rowan Oak.
Life is not interested in good and evil. Don Quixote was constantly choosing between good and evil, but then he was choosing in his dream state. He was mad. He entered reality only when he was so busy trying to cope with people that he had no time to distinguish between good and evil. Since people exist only in life, they must devote their time simply to being alive. Life is motion. Emotion is concerned with what makes man move, which is ambition, power, pleasure. What time a man can take to devote to morality, he must take by force from the motion of which he is a part. He is compelled to make choices between good and evil sooner or later, because moral conscience demands that from him, in order that he can live with himself tomorrow. His moral conscience is the curse he had to accept from the gods in order to gain from them the right to dream. William Faulkner.
They say love dies between two people. That's wrong. It doesn't die. It just leaves you, goes away if you aren't good enough, worthy enough. It doesn't die. You're the one that dies. It's like the ocean. If you're no good, if you begin to make a bad smell in it, it just spews you up somewhere to die. You die anyway. But I had rather drown in the ocean than be irped up onto a strip of dead beach and be dried away by the sun into a little foul smear with no name to it. Just this was for an epitaph. William Faulkner, The Wild Palms.
That was when I learned that words are no good, that words don't ever fit even what they are trying to say at. When he was born, I knew that motherhood was invented by someone who had to have a word for it, because the ones that had the children didn't care whether there was a word for it or not. I knew that fear was invented by someone that had never had the fear. Pride, who had never had the pride. William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying.
I can remember how when I was young, I believed death to be a phenomenon of the body. Now I know it merely as a function of the mind, and that of the minds of the ones who suffer the bereavement. The nihilists say it is the end, the fundamentalists, the beginning, when in reality it is no more than a single tenant or family moving out of a tenement or a town. William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying.
99% talent, 99% discipline, 99% work. He must never be satisfied with what he does. It is never as good as it can be done. Always dream and shoot higher than you know you can do. Don't bother just to be better than your contemporaries or predecessors. Try to be better than yourself. An artist is a creature driven by demons. He doesn't know why they choose him, and he's usually too busy to wonder why. He is completely amoral, and that he will rob, borrow, beg, or steal from anybody and everybody to get the work done. William Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury.
Welcome back to this special edition of Crosstalk. We are here exploring Rowan Oak, the home of literary giant William Faulkner. Joining me to talk about its influence of Faulkner's work is Dr. Jay Watson, the Howery Professor of Faulkner Studies from the University of Mississippi. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
So, Dr. Watson, when Faulkner first bought this house in the 1930s, it was in disrepair. Why did he like the estate?
You're right that the house was in terrible condition, and I'm going to give you a fairly complicated answer to why he might have liked the estate. Part of the reason is that people in Oxford didn't think much of William Faulkner at that time. He'd just begun his literary career. He was publishing novels, but they weren't very successful. They weren't big sellers. And so it was unusual for the eldest son of a prominent family to decide he wanted a life in the arts, a life as a writer. It was expected that usually that eldest sons might go into a profession, might run a business, be a doctor or lawyer, and yet here's this young man who wants to be an artist. And so Oxford used to make fun of him. Buying a house like this, a big Greek Revival antebellum home with some of the first significant money that Faulkner had ever earned from his writing, was in part his way of telling the community that he was somebody, that he mattered. And it was a way of speaking their language, the language of possessions and belongings that would impress them. So I think that was part of what motivated him, in addition to the fact that homes like this were very, very interesting and troubled places in Southern history, and they would go on to become places like that in his writing.
What about the house itself? What did he like the architecture of the house, the style?
I think that the style probably spoke to him because it was associated with so many of the prominent families in town who had also owned homes like this. This home was designed in the 1840s by an architect in the area who also built several other homes that you can see around Oxford. And so they're among the grandest and finest examples of Greek Revival architecture that we have here.
Well, Faulkner's work spans decades. What was written in the home?
The first novel that he wrote after moving to Rowan Oak was Light in August, which he wrote in 1931 and published in 1932. And there's actually a story about that novel that takes place right here on this porch behind us. Faulkner liked to come out here on this porch and work in the afternoons. It was sort of a private place, and it was a place where he could enjoy being outdoors and still keep going on his novels and stories. And so he was working on this long manuscript that at the time he was calling Dark House. The working title for this novel was Dark House. And he was actually writing on the manuscript in August of 1931 when his wife Estelle came out the doors here and joined him on the patio late in the afternoon. And Estelle said, "Bill, have you ever noticed that there's something about the light in August, that it's just magical?" And Faulkner jumped up and said, "That's it." Ran in the house, grabbed the cover sheet of his manuscript, scribbled out the title Dark House, and wrote Light in August on the cover page of his manuscript. So not only was that the first novel that he worked on here, there was even a sort of an inspiring scene out on this porch that helped give him the idea for this wonderful title that he gave the novel.
What else is written in the house?
He wrote Absalom, Absalom, his great work of the 1930s that I understand GHS students have been studying this year. He wrote Go Down Moses, The Hamlet, some of his major works from the 1940s. He wrote A Fable, his great failed novel that he had kind of hoped and dreamed would be his magnum opus. He wrote that in the little office that he added on to the house in 1950, which you can see inside. So he wrote probably a dozen novels in Rowan Oak.
Do you think Rowan Oak influenced the creativity of his writings?
I think he can't help but have thought about some of the paradoxes of living in a home like this when he was writing often about elite and powerful Mississippi families. And I can elaborate on that if you'll give me a moment, because one thing I would say about the Greek Revival architecture that you see in homes like this, so very stately homes with pleasing rectangular dimensions and columns and the triangular portico that you'll see over the front of the house. By the time this home was built in the 1850s, late 1840s, Greek Revival architecture was becoming a kind of sectional phenomenon. It was becoming associated with the South. Earlier in the nation's history, you might have seen that architecture in other places. Like, for instance, you'll see it on the National Mall in Washington, in some of the buildings that date from the early 1800s. But by the 1840s, the national debate over slavery had begun. And Southerners, especially prominent Southerners and powerful Southerners, were looking for ways to make the case for slavery as the foundation of a great civilization or a great society. And one of the things that they attempted in order to create this propaganda was they began building in Greek Revival architecture. And that was a gesture that for them linked their homes and their buildings to buildings from two great civilizations of the past, the Greeks and the Romans, that were both slave-holding civilizations. So when this home was built, this style of architecture was propaganda, and it was pro-slavery propaganda. And yet Faulkner's fiction knows that there is a darker history of injustice that lurks behind and beneath these homes. Many of these homes were built by slaves. Even the ones that were not built by slaves were built with the wealth that slavery had made possible for their owners. And so one of the most fascinating contradictions in Faulkner's career is that homes like this appear all the time in his fiction, and usually terrible things happen in them. They burn down, people are murdered, there is family abuse, women are assaulted. And so over and over again, Faulkner tells stories that actually register the fact that homes like this are haunted by a history of exploitation and injustice. And yet, as we've seen, when Faulkner first began to amass some money from his writing career, he purchased a home like this. So he used this architectural vocabulary to prove that he had arrived to the town of Oxford. And for me, this never ceases to be a fascinating paradox between the artist's life and the artist's work.
Well, everybody knows that Faulkner's writing is quite unique. Why is that?
Well, Faulkner was restlessly, ceaselessly inventive and experimental in his writing. People will say that Faulkner never wrote the same novel twice. And that's absolutely true of the formal qualities and the stylistic qualities of his work. And so one of the things that makes it difficult to readers is that Faulkner was always pushing the boundaries of the novel and of narrative fiction and what storytelling could accomplish. And this has made him one of the real innovative, leading narrative artists of the 20th century.
Well, Faulkner never wrote a story twice, but he did repeat characters in his novels. Why did he do that?
He did that because he had created an imaginary world that he called Yoknapatawpha County. And that fictional county and its county seat of Jefferson were modeled very, very closely on Lafayette County and Oxford, the actual county and town in which Faulkner lived. But he envisioned most of his major fiction as set in this fictional county, and that meant that it was set among a population of characters who might reappear from novel to novel. This was part of his way of grounding any specific story he was telling in the very powerful imaginative reality for him of Yoknapatawpha. And so this is why characters will circulate in and out of novels and across novels and stories. In one text, a character or a family may be the most important figures. In another text, they may recede more into the background. But it's because this world that he had created and populated in his imagination was always with him in a really vivid way every time he started a new story.
Well, Faulkner is really descriptive about certain things in his novels, such as nature. Why is that?
Faulkner spent a lot of time outdoors as a young man. He loved to hunt. His father took him hunting. The woman, Caroline Barr, who was a domestic worker for the Faulkner family, took him on walks through the woods, taught him the names of birds and of plants and of flowers. And even later on in his adult life, he led a Boy Scout troop around Oxford and would take the kids out into the woods and into nature. So this always seems to have been a part of how he experienced Mississippi and experienced his native world, and so he always wrote about it with particularly close attention, I think, and really loving detail.
William Faulkner was known as a recluse. Did this affect his writing?
I think it affected his writing by making it possible. It's true that Faulkner was a very, very private individual. This wall behind us was a privacy wall that he built after acquiring the house. So this wall was not here when he purchased Rowan Oak, but he added it later so that he could work out here on this porch and work in private. So he cultivated that sense of privacy even while being right in the middle of things and right at the heart of his community. This home is less than a mile from the town square of Oxford. And so I think that he was just by temperament a very kind of guarded and private individual, and so he needed to create a kind of buffer for himself between himself as an individual and the larger community. And Rowan Oak and the land around it and the woods around it wound up serving that role for him.
Why do you think Rowan Oak is still so popular today?
I think people respond imaginatively to being in the presence of genius and to having a tangible connection to a place where great things happened. And some of the real literary monuments of the 20th century or of 20th century America were written in this house. So this is not only where he lived, it was where he worked. And I think that people find that inspiring, to still have a concrete link to that kind of achievement and to great accomplishments. And so they find themselves drawn here. And I don't know if you and your production team will agree, but I think there's still kind of a vibe. There's an aura about this place that where, in a way, Faulkner still lingers here. And that makes this kind of a unique resource for people who love his work or who are interested in his life story.
I think everyone can agree that Rowan Oak is a beautiful home. What did it mean to Faulkner?
One of the things that it meant to Faulkner was that he was taking his responsibility seriously as a family man. So Faulkner had just married in 1929, and he and his wife were living in an apartment in town. She also came to the marriage with 2 children from her first marriage. So Faulkner was becoming a father, becoming a stepfather in 1929. And I think one of the things he wanted to do was establish himself really as the head of a household in a home. And so moving out of his rented apartment into a house of his own and a house of his family's own was very important to him. And again, it made him feel that he was taking seriously his duties and responsibilities, again, as an eldest son.
Well, Mr. Watson, thank you so much for coming on to our show today.
Thanks, it was a pleasure talking with you.
Now, here's some more readings from Faulkner's enormous library of works.
It is just dawn, daylight, that gray and lonely suspension filled with the peaceful and tentative waking of birds. The air and breathe is like spring water. He breathes deep and slow, feeling with each breath himself diffused in the natural grayness, becoming one with loneliness and quiet that has never known fury or despair. That was all I wanted, he thinks, in a quiet and slow amazement. That was all for 30 years. That didn't seem to be a whole lot to ask in 30 years. William Faulkner, light novels.
I lied, I said.
I know it, he said.
Then do something about it. Do anything just so it's something.
I can't, he said.
There ain't anything to do? Not anything?
I didn't say that, Grandfather said. I said I couldn't. You can.
What? I said. How can I forget it? Tell me how to.
You can't, he said. Nothing is ever lost. It's too valuable.
Then what can I do?
Live with it, Grandfather said.
Live with it? You mean forever? For the rest of my life? Not ever to get rid of it? Never? I can't. Don't you see that I can't?
Yes, you can, he said. You will. A gentleman always does. A gentleman can live through anything.
He faces anything. A gentleman accepts the responsibility of his actions and bears the burden of their consequences, even when he did not himself instigate them, but only acquiesced to them. Didn't say no, though he knew he should.
William Faulkner, The Reivers, A Reminiscence.
He had a word, too. Love, he called it. But I had been used to words for a long time. I knew that that word was like the others, just a shape to fill a lack. That when the right time came, You wouldn't need a word for that anymore, for pride or fear. One day, I was talking to Cora. She prayed for me because she believed I was blind to sin, wanting me to kneel and pray too. Because people to whom sin is just a matter of words, to them salvation is just words too. William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying.
You get born and you try this. And you don't know why, only you keep on trying it. And you are born at the same time with a lot of other people, all mixed up with them, like trying to, having to, move your arms and legs with strings, only the same strings are hitched to all the other arms and legs, and the others all trying. And they don't know why either, except that the strings are all in one another's way, like 5 or 6 people all trying to make a rug on the same loom, only each one wants to weave his own pattern into the rug. And it can't matter, you know that, or the ones that set up the loom would have arranged things a little better. And yet, it must matter, because you keep on trying, or having to keep on trying, and then all of a sudden, it's all over. William Faulkner, Absalom, Absalom.
Sometimes I could put myself to sleep, saying that over and over, until after the honeysuckle got all mixed up in it, the whole thing came to symbolize night, and unrest. I seemed to be lying neither asleep nor awake, looking down a long corridor of gray half-light, where all stable things had become shadowy, paradoxical. All I had done, shadows. All I had felt, suffered, taking visible form, antic and perverse mocking, without relevance inherent themselves, with the denial of the significance. They should have affirmed thinking. I was not who, was not who. William Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury.
At one time, I thought the most important thing was talent. I think now that the young man or the young woman must possess or teach himself, train himself in infinite patience, which is to try and to try and to try until it comes out right. He must train himself in ruthless intolerance. That is, to throw away anything that is false, no matter how much he might love that page or that paragraph. The most important thing is insight, that is, curiosity to mull, to wonder, and to muse why it is that man does what he does. And if you have that, then I don't think that talent makes much difference, whether you've got that or not. I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Watson, and the University of Mississippi for making today possible. And if you're looking to travel outside of Memphis, I highly recommend Rowan Oak. You can see Rowan Oak Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 12 and 2 to 4, or Sundays from 2 to 4. And for more information, go to rowanoak.com. I'm Sara Mayers, and from all of us here at GHS-TV, thank you for watching Crosstalk, and I hope to see you again soon.